Honoring Mr. Miller on page 101 in your health book. Jimmy and his family were getting ready for the church banquet. Jimmy was combing his hair and trying some different styles. "Hurry up, Jimmy," yelled David. "It's almost time to go." Okay, I'm almost ready." Jimmy turned around to look at David. "You look good. Is Jenny going to be there?" Jimmy asked with a grin. "Very funny, little brother," replied David. "We need to meet Mom and David in the kitchen." Mom checked the boys' clothes and hair. Then David said, "It's time to go," and they got into the car. As David drove to the church, he reminded the boys to be friendly and respectful. When you speak to an adult, remember to say Mr. or Mrs. with their last names. Be a good listener and don't interrupt, he instructed. Look for ways to help others, added Mom, especially the older people. Page 102. When they arrived at church, the family walked to the banquet room. It was almost full and everyone was talking. The family found a table and sat down. There was one empty chair at their table. Jimmy glanced out the window and saw Mr. Miller. He was an older man who attended the church and lived alone. "Dad, may I ask Mr. Miller to sit with us?" asked Jimmy. "That's a great idea, Jimmy. Go and ask him," Dad answered. Jimmy hurried to the door and held it open. "Hello, Mr. Miller. How are you? Would you like to sit at our table?" asked Jimmy. "We're over there." Mr. Miller looked toward the table and saw Jimmy's parents smiling and motioning for him to, page 103, join them. "That would be very nice," Mr. Miller agreed. They walked to the table and had a seat. "We are glad you could join us," welcomed Dad. "How are you?" "I'm getting hungry," Mr. Miller said with a smile. Just then the pastor stood up. He gave directions for getting food at the serving line and where to find the water and coffee. Then he prayed for the meal. Soon it was time for Jimmy's table to get food. As they walked toward the food, Jimmy stayed with Mr. Miller. While they got their food, Mr. Miller and Jimmy talked about their favorite foods. Soon Jimmy took his plate to the table. He returned to the serving line and asked, "Mr. Miller, may I take your plate to the table?" "Thank you, Jimmy. That would help me," said Mr. Miller. Jimmy walked to the table and put the plate down. He walked back and got a glass of water. Mr. Miller was walking to the table with a cup of coffee and a small plate with a pie on it. He was trying hard not to spill the coffee. We're going to stop there, but keep in mind, boys and girls, that the boys' mom and dad wanted them to talk to the grown-ups and say Mr. and Mrs. And it's always important to be respectful to a grown-up. You call me Mrs. Beck. You would not come in and call me by my first name because that would not be respectful. You don't call other grown-ups by their first name unless they say it's okay. And it's just important to remember that you call grown-ups that to show respect. And at the end, at page 103, we saw that Jimmy was being respectful to Mr. Miller, and we saw that he was helping him with his plate of food, and he stayed with him. So I want you to think, boys and girls, of different ways that you can be respectful to other grown-ups that you know. How are you respectful to me when you're in the classroom? How are you respectful to other grown-ups that you know? How are you respectful to your mom and dad? They're grown-ups. So think about that. How are you going to be respectful in the future? This week, next week, think of ideas that you can be respectful to people that you know that are older than you, that you are respectful to the grown-ups in your life. And how can you do that to show how are you not only obedient to them, but to God also?